These are the basics.
Really good details and enthusiasm.
Word choices, the images, the metaphors, engage with what the author has written.
In your own words.
Think about storytellers in your life.
Those words are going to tell you more about the author than you ever thought possible.
You're making decisions about
You
your
do
writing.
have a place in the overall conversation
on paper.
See where your story goes from there.
Good luck.
Hey guys, I'm Alexandra Morano and I teach English 111 here at ACC, and I am going to talk to you today about counterarguments and how you use them in your persuasive papers. So first, what are counterarguments? So counterarguments are arguments from the other side, the opposing side. They're arguments that are against your main point or your main points. They're the things essentially that your opposition would say in response to your argument. Why do you have to include these in your essay? Well, including counterarguments makes you seem like you really know what you're talking about. Including counterarguments helps you look like you've done all of your research and all of your homework and you really understand all sides of the issue. So essentially, counterarguments just make you seem more credible as a writer, but they also allow your reader to really see that you've considered all sides and your view is still the right view. And that's the point of a persuasive paper. What's really important about counterarguments is formatting them correctly. You don't want to just put the opposition's viewpoint in your paper without explaining that it's their viewpoint, not yours. If you just drop the opposition's viewpoint in without really contextualizing it well, then the paper starts to sound like a pro-con paper, and we're beyond that. We're in college. We're writing things that are much more academic than that these days. So your counterarguments should be formatted in a way that it's obvious to your reader that it's not your view you're sharing. Some ideas. You could say something, you could set up your sentence, your counterargument sentence in some way like this. The opposition would argue X, Y, and Z. Or people who disagree with me might say X, Y, and Z. The people who are wrong about this issue would argue X, Y, and Z. Something like that, some introduction to your counterargument that explains or shows that it's definitely not your viewpoint that you're sharing. So formatting them is very important. Next, what do you do with them in your paper? So you know what they are, you know why you have to include them, and you know how to format them. But you can't just put them into your paper. You have to do something with them. And by that, I mean you have to respond to them. If you're introducing the opposition's viewpoint, the opposing argument in your paper, you can't just introduce it and leave it. You have to say something about it. So there are two ways to respond to a counterargument that you share in your paper. You can refute, straight up refute. Refuting means essentially that you say why it's wrong. Some people who disagree with me would say X, Y, and Z. Here's why these people are wrong. And you explain. You might use research to do that, or you might just hearken back to some of your previous points. So that's refuting. The second way that you can respond to counterarguments is to concede a little bit. This one gets tricky because when you concede, you're not saying the counterargument is right. You're not like, oh, here's the counterargument, and they're right. Because if you did that, it would sort of negate the point of your paper, right? So instead, when you concede, you're acknowledging that the counterargument might have a little bit of a point, that something that they're saying is valid. But still, you're going to argue that ultimately your point is the stronger or more correct point. So it's tricky. You have to finesse that really well. So an example of refuting would be something like, people who disagree with me would say X, Y, and Z. And while they're right about X, Y and Z are still not correct. Something like that, all right? And there are some examples, more specific examples in your lecture notes on these. Okay, lastly, where do you put counterarguments in your paper? Well, that's largely up to you. It could be that you respond to each one of your arguments, each one of your points in your paper with a counterargument, and then of course refute or concede that counterargument. and if you chose to do that, you'd have many counterarguments in your paper, and they would show up after each of your main point paragraphs, either as a part of those paragraphs or as a separate paragraph, depending on the length of your paper. That organization would look like point, counterargument, point, counterargument, point, counterargument. The second way that you could include counterarguments in your paper, the second place that you could include them, would be after you stated all of your points in a counterargument paragraph. So that would look like point, 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 counterargument or counterarguments, and then your conclusion would come after that. What's important to keep in mind is that generally counterarguments are not mentioned in introductions and they're not mentioned in conclusions. So they're part of the body of your paper. They're a way that you get your points to be a little bit stronger, but they aren't part of your introduction or conclusion. All right, that's information about counterarguments. Good luck getting them in your paper.